is 2311. The world is engulfed in the flames of a decades-long World War III, and only the United States remains unscathed. For years, they've been sending out generation ships to colonize faraway star systems and galaxies, hoping that the human race will survive out in the stars, and not just in our solar system. Like clockwork, the generation ships disappear off scope, but considering how large space is, NASA doesn't think too much of it. One day, hundreds of years after it leaves, the first generation ship reappears and sends data back to Earth before blinking out of existence. NASA decrypts the data and it discovers a wormhole near Mercury. With a mystery of what's happened to the lost generation ships, they send 2 pilots out in their ships to traverse the wormhole. For a story this involved and stakes-ridden, there's only one appropriate format to present it in. A Brick Breaker. This is Twin Breaker, a Sacred Symbols adventure. The first game in a new ongoing partnership between indie developer Lily Mo Games and popular PlayStation podcaster Colin Moriarty. For those unaware, Colin Moriarty used to work at IGN and was co-host of their PlayStation podcast, Podcast Beyond. He and Greg Miller, with shoutouts to Ryan Clements and Andrew Goldfarb, were the PlayStation dream team on the internet. Between Miller's over-the-top and zany personality and Colin's analytically informed view on the PlayStation ecosystem, they were a match made in heaven, bringing several hundred episodes of podcast greatness to listeners. In 2015, both he and Greg left IGN to form Kinda Funny and a new PlayStation podcast. P.S. I love you, XOXO. Get it? Yep, PS as in PlayStation, then XO, the X and circle buttons. Get funny joke. As Podcast Beyond unfortunately scrambled to find a new identity for itself with their main hosts gone, PS I Love You was the same Colin and Greg greatness with a fresh coat of paint. However, in March 2017, following a series of unfortunate events that even today has left the Kinda Funny community somewhat split, Colin left the company in his position as co-host of PS I Love You. His new venture was Colin's Last Stand, which he runs to this day, and he started yet another new PlayStation podcast, this one known as Sacred Symbols. With his new co-host being YouTuber Chris Raygun, Sacred Symbols is running strong and appears to not be stopping anytime soon. This brings us to Twin Breaker, a video game based on / inspired by the podcast written by Colin himself. Before we go further, I will admit up front that I've been a fan of Colin's for years and am a patron of CLS on Patreon, so take whatever I say with a grain of salt if you wish, as I am biased towards his content. As I mentioned earlier, it's a brick breaker, in which the player controls paddles and bounces a ball around an arena trying to break all the bricks or blocks in a stage. This type of game gives Twin Breaker a very arcadey classic feel, one which I'm very unfamiliar with as a gamer. Sure, I've put a little bit of time into free mobile versions of Pac-Man and Galaga, but I've grown up in the 3D era of video games, so Brick Breaker is a little out of my wheelhouse of expertise. Going into the game, I wasn't sure what I'd think of it. Would it be possible that I wouldn't be able to wrap my head around it and put it down in frustration, or would I be able to understand the mechanics just fine and enjoy the game like any modern release I might pick up? Thankfully, it's the latter, and I had a blast with this game. Modern games may have jaw-dropping graphics and enhanced mechanics thanks to powerful hardware, but Twin Breaker is all about pure gameplay fun, with some challenge on the side. The player uses 2 paddles to bounce a ball across the stage to destroy the objects, as I mentioned earlier. The story, however, gives a little extra context for these paddles. Those paddles are the ships that NASA has sent to investigate the wormhole, piloted by podcast hosts Colin and Chris. Every 5 levels or so, the gameplay is bookended by little conversations that push the story forward and lead into boss fights. These conversations can be skipped to get right into the gameplay, but for fans of Colin's work, it's fun to engage in the story because the dialogue feels authentic to the characters. If Colin is pondering his existential worth while flying a spaceship, listeners will nod and know that's 100% something Colin would do. The early levels start out easy enough for the player to grasp on the mechanics. The left analog stick moves the left ship across the screen, while the right analog stick moves the right ship across the screen. The player has to make sure the ball doesn't pass the bumpers and hit a dead zone, or they risk losing a life. Lose all 3, and it could be game over. As long as the player has 100 points to spend on a stage, though, they can buy themselves a new life. While this may seem enticing to people wanting to just get through the levels, it comes with a risk/reward. Sure, you can spend 100 points to buy a new life, but 100 points can be the divide between getting a high score on a level or failing it. Each level grades you on how many points are accumulated as the ball hits blocks. 5 for a hit, 10 for a break. Depending on how fast the level is completed, it adds to the bonus score at the end, and players can earn E, D, C, B, A, and S ranks. To help out with earning points, pickups will drop for broken blocks that can lead to a high score. Double points in the heavy ball are my personal favorites, as the combo gets the score multiplier skyrocketing. Other pickups may be more detrimental to your score, however. One shrinks your paddles, making it harder to reach the ball since it has to cover more ground. Alien bugs will also emerge from broken blocks and temporarily stun your ships, causing them to move slower due to the damage taken. and depending on the situation, the multi-ball can be the difference between winning and losing a stage. On one life left, a multi-ball is the last thing you want, as multiple balls bouncing around the stage can become impossible to keep track of, and before you know it, you're down to one ball and it's sailing right past you into the dead zone. Game over. Then of course there's a chance to pick up multiple multi-balls, and the results can be chaotic. About halfway through the 40 levels, Twin Breaker turns into Brain Breaker. In an ultimate challenge of multitasking, a grand total of 4 paddles are on screen, meaning a player has to worry about both vertical and horizontal dead zones. Both left paddles are controlled by moving the left analog stick up and down or left and right, and the inverse is true of the right paddles. Barry Johnson, the developer of the game, is an evil genius for thinking of this mechanic. When it first showed up, I smiled and thought, oh, what a clever and interesting way of spicing up the gameplay. As I played through them though, I quickly realized that the levels were insanely difficult to keep up with thanks to the added dimension of gameplay. It's in these levels where the shield wall pickup becomes invaluable. The last 10 levels of the game are comprised of a combo of all 3 different play styles, the vertical, horizontal, and quad paddles. With 40 levels complete, New Game Plus is unlocked, allowing the player to play altered versions of the 40 levels to go for even higher scores. And these higher scores aren't without their rewards. Getting an A, S, A+, or S+ rank will unlock codex entries that expand on the lore of Twin Breaker. I love that in a game about aliens, wormholes, and time travel, the most outlandish thing about it is the idea that the United States' budget will ever be balanced. If the variety of 80 levels isn't enough, there are several other game modes available to play. There's a marathon mode where the player tries to play the game as far as possible with a continuous set of lives. I haven't made it that far, but I'm sure it's entirely possible to get all the way to level 40, not losing, and then lose to the final boss and get a game over. Since I'm pretty sure Brick Breaker's evolved from Pong, there's a Pong mode where the player will bounce the ball against the bosses from the game and try to score points against it. Catcher and shooter modes are very similar but with slight differences. Catcher mode involves catching falling items for as long as possible without letting 3 slip past. Shooter mode sees the player trying to destroy as many blocks as possible without 3 slipping past. Each one presents a unique challenge for high score fanatics to chase. Boss rush mode is pretty simplistic, as it's a combination of the different boss modes, one after the other. Same rules apply as in marathon mode, as the player has their lives tied to the stages instead of just one. Finally, there's random mode, with random stages for a player to waste some time in while waiting in the dentist's office or something. Overall, the game is really fun and addicting. I was hoping that I would like it considering it's based on the internet's #1 PlayStation podcast, but I didn't think I'd end up liking it as much as I did. There is something about it that I find interesting though. While the footage that I've been showing you on screen was captured on my PS4, I spent the majority of my time with the game on PlayStation Vita. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, the Vita lives. No matter what system you buy the game on, Twin Breaker is a cross-buy game, which means you buy one version, you get the other. As I was playing it, I said to myself that the game was made for Vita, and I didn't know how right I was. Barry Johnson said on a recent episode of Sacred Simples Plus, a Simple Mental podcast that you can access on the Collins Last Stand Patreon for just $2 a month, said that the game was developed on Vita hardware and was transferred over to the PS4. So no wonder it felt at home there. I don't know what it is exactly about the PS4 version, but to me it felt harder. Since the games are identical and there are a few differences between them other than resolution, I'm left scratching my head as to why the PS4 version was more difficult for me. The possibility is that since my PS4 is plugged into a 50-inch TV screen, the added real estate may do a weird perception trick with my brain. So the paddles appear to be moving slower than they actually are, which affects my gameplay and isn't the fault of the game, but rather myself. Either way though, the game is still a blast. So what's the best deal? An arcade-inspired Brick Breaker game that is a cross-buy between PS4 and Vita with 2 separate trophy lists would be a steal no matter what the price tag is on it, but both Colin and Barry are conscious about how important time and money is, and so the asking price is only $10. I personally think that this game could easily go for $20 based on its quality, but who am I to argue with the price the developer sets? $10 is definitely a steal. While this game is certainly going to be a blast for fans of Colin and Sacred Simples, anyone looking for a good game to distract themselves from the pandemic currently going on won't go wrong with this one. It'll be a nice game to tide everyone over until The Last of Us Part 2 comes out in May. Uh-oh.